this chapter, we are going to apply what we learned in chapter 13, all the unit circle, all the identities, or not identities, but like the trig functions, into solving some equations. First, let's review. So remember that cosecant, that's what CSC means, is 1 over sine. Secant, which is SEC, that is 1 over cosine. Let's skip tangent for now. Okay, sine in another way is 1 over cosecant, right? Because if you kind of look at this is reciprocal of each other, so this must also be true. Cosine is therefore 1 over secant. And then if you kind of think about the reciprocal identities, that's what we're doing right now, then tangent is another way of saying 1 over cotangent, and then cotangent is 1 over tangent. Now you probably remember that tangent and cotangent has another definition. Tangent is another way of saying sine over cosine, and so cotangent is the same as saying cosine over sine. Okay, now let us look at the unit circle. So this unit circle doesn't have any angle measurements for clarity. It's just a little easier to kind of show you this without the angles. So let's just say that I take this angle here, which is 30 degrees, and I am going to draw a straight line down to the x-axis, which creates a 90 degrees. Now, since it's a 90 degrees, you can see that this is pretty much a right triangle. And right triangles must follow Pythagorean theorem. And Pythagorean theorem says a squared plus b squared must equal c squared. Okay, so let's write that down. A squared plus b squared is c squared. Now, if you kind of think about the unit circle. So in a unit circle, what part of the unit circle is a unit is the radius, right? So we know that this is 1 because the radius is 1. And since this is 30 degrees, then recall that we said the length of the x direction is cosine, and the length of the y direction is sine. So we can actually just say that this part is cosine 30 degrees, right? The x part of 30 degrees, and we know that number is square root 3 over 2. So make sure that you refresh your memory on unit circle values, because if you don't, this chapter is going to take forever trying to solve it, because you have to memorize the unit circle like a multiplication chart so that it will be fast. Okay, so b is sine 30, the y part of the 30 degrees, which is also 1/2. Okay, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So we can just say that a is, we know that a is square root 3 over 2 squared, plus b is 1/2, and then c is 1. And so let's kind of verify. Let's go ahead and verify to see if this is true. So let's kind of do some algebra review. Square root 3 over 2 squared is 3 over 4. 1/2 squared is 1/4. 3/4 plus 1/4 is 4 over 4, which is 1. And that is the same as 1 squared, so this makes sense. Okay, so now that we know that makes sense, we're going to kind of do a different substitution and say that square root 3 over 2 is the same thing as cosine 30, right? So cosine 30 degrees squared plus, and in this triangle, 1/2 represents sine 30. So sine 30 degrees squared is 1 squared, or let's just put 1. Okay, So that is going to be true because we're just substituting things that are true into this identity, and so it must still be true. Now, I drew a right triangle at the 30 degrees, but I don't have to do that. I could draw a right triangle at 45 degrees. I can draw a right triangle at 60 degrees, and everything must follow a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And so this angle doesn't matter. I can put any angle in there and then it will always be true. So then we're just going to put an angle and just say that that angle just has to be the same angle, and then this will be true. You can put anything you want. You can put 600 degrees if you want, and it will still be true. Now, we don't write it this way, or your book does not write things this way. Cosine theta squared is going to be cosine square theta, like this. And that's just how they write. And, you can't put that in the calculator. You can't put sine and then put a square button and then a number. It's not going to work. It's automatically going to do this in the calculator. So just know this is kind of the calculator version. And then this is how you write it. So just kind of keep that in mind so you don't get confused when you see sine square x. You're hopefully not thinking, what does that actually mean? It just means sine x, the whole thing squared. All right, so this is plus sine squared theta equals 1. This is the first identity you have to memorize. This is the Pythagorean identity for trig, the first one. So first one, cosine squared plus sine squared equals 1. The second identity is a manipulation of this first one. So you have to get this first one memorized, no matter what. But it's pretty easy. Just cosine squared plus sine squared is 1. And all of these identities equal 1. Okay, so what we're going to, in a way. What we're going to do now is we're going to get to the second identity by dividing everything by cosine squared. All right, cosine divided by cosine, cosine squared divided by cosine squared is pretty obvious. It's 1. Sine squared over cosine squared may be a little bit confusing. So let's just kind of think about it without the squared. Without the squared, sine over cosine is what? Sine over cosine, we just talked about it. It is tangent. And since they're both squared, this is going to be squared. So 1 plus tangent squared. So sine squared over cosine squared is tangent squared. All right, last one. This one may be a little bit tricky at first as well. 1 over cosine squared. 1 over cosine squared. So you might not know what 1 over cosine squared is, but 1 over cosine, just 1 over cosine is secant, right? And so 1 over cosine squared is basically 1 over cosine, the whole thing squared. So this is going to be secant squared. Okay. All right. Now let's go to the last one. The last one is very similar. Instead of dividing by cosine squared, we're going to divide by sine squared. All right, so we're going to do the same thing as before. Cosine squared over sine squared. Now that you're trained, you probably can tell what it's going to be. So it's basically cosine over sine and then the whole thing squared. So cosine over sine is cotangent. And since it's just the whole thing squared, this is cotangent squared. Plus sine squared over sine squared is 1. Plus, equals 1 over sine squared. So that is 1 over sine, the whole thing squared. So 1 over sine is cosecant. And then the whole thing squared, so cosecant squared. So these are the 3 that you have to memorize. Cosine plus sine equals 1, or so cosine squared plus sine squared equals 1. It has to be squared because remember it's Pythagorean theorem. So a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And then from there, you're just dividing by sine squared or dividing by cosine squared to get to the other two. What I like to do is I always kind of change this one to 1 plus cotangent squared. So I'm just swapping the placement of these two. Equals cosecant squared, because now it just kind of looks very similar to the second one, so it's easier to memorize. And a lot of times students over the years says, oh, they just remember this as 1TS and this is 1CC, and then kind of go from there. And here's a little math joke to make memorizing a little easier. I wish I were a sine squared and you were a cosine squared, so together we would be 1. Very cute comic strip to show your loved one. Okay, so now let's go ahead and apply. All right, so let's do easy ones first. So on your homework, what you're doing is going to be just trying to simplify a expression. So it's not going to equal anything because it's an expression. But what you're doing is make it into the simplest form possible by changing things around to its other kind of identities. So for example, cosecant times tangent. Cosecant, remember, is 1 over sine. Tangent is sine over cosine. And so you can see that since they're multiplied together, sines are going to cancel. It's 1 over cosine. Now 1 over cosine is not the easiest or the simplest form. The simplest form is, so kind of think about what 1 over cosine is. 1 over cosine is secant. So cosecant times tangent is really just secant. All right, so let's go ahead and have you try secant times cotangent. Okay, the answer is cosecant. All right, so these kind of are, in the same direction. So let's have you pause the video, try these, come back and check your answer. Number 2 is a little bit trickier, not because the problem is tricky, but there are a lot of things in here that require complex fractions. And so, this is where you don't want to kill a cat. Okay, so please be careful. Go ahead and pause the video and solve these, come back and check your answer. All right, so both of these answers are 1. Okay, you probably got 1 for number 1. Number 2, you may have gotten into some problems with the complex fractions. So let's kind of do a little review on complex fractions in Algebra 2. First, let's change everything to sine cosine. So cosecant is 1 over sine. And then sine plus cosine times cosine over sine. Okay, I'm going to change this part so that it's just one expression. 1 over sine over sine theta plus cosine squared over sine. All right. Okay, so if you recall from a few chapters ago, this is a complex fraction because you have basically 2 fractions inside a big fraction. So that's not acceptable. We need to simplify that. And the fastest way to simplify this, if you recall, is to multiply by the least common denominator. The least common denominator has to do with the fractions that's inside the fraction. There are 2 fractions here. Well, this one is technically over 1, but we can just ignore that. So the least common denominator is sine. So what we're going to do is multiply top by sine and multiply the bottom by sine. And then we're going to distribute. So this is going to distribute here. So basically sine times that 1 over sine becomes 1. And then let's look at the bottom one. So you're going to distribute. So sine times sine is sine squared. And then this one, sine times cosine squared over sine. That sine cancels, so you end up with cosine squared. Now recall, sine squared plus cosine squared. I know that you memorize it as cosine squared plus sine squared, but remember that addition is, I think it's called a commutative property, so you can switch the order. So sine squared plus cosine squared is the same as cosine squared plus sine squared. And both equal 1. So this is really 1 over 1. So the answer is 1. All right, one more. And then we're done with this part for today. Okay, simplify the trig expression. So this is a challenge question because it does require more of the algebra that you learned in the past than other times. So go ahead and give this one a try. Pause the video, come back and check. All right, so let's go ahead and solve this. This part becomes 1 minus sine squared. So if you kind of want to remember, this is a minus b times a plus b, which becomes a squared minus b squared, times cosecant squared plus 1. Please remember that this is not like this. So it's not it's not multiplied by another binomial. Cosecant is being multiplied to those two other things and then a plus 1. So it depends on what you want to do at this time. I am just going to change everything to sine and cosine. There are many ways to get to the same answer, so you just do what is easier for you at the time. Okay, so this becomes, I'm going to distribute, so this is 1 over sine squared, and and then this sine squared times 1 over sine squared becomes 1, so it's just minus 1, and then plus 1. This cancels. 1 over sine squared is the answer, but that's not a simplified form. 1 over sine squared is cosecant squared.